Hey, this is Joel Duff. Welcome back to my channel. And today I've got answering student questions. Actually, just one question this time. This is an excerpt of what became a 5.5-hour video that I made for my students this summer. Right? They asked in a discussion forum a series of 25 questions, 25 students, 25 questions, and I decided I would do a video response to them. In my class, when I'm doing face-to-face, they ask anonymous questions, and I have to stand in front of the class and give somewhere between a 2 and a 5-minute response. Now, I'm not limited to the 5 minutes since I was on video, and obviously I wasn't limited because I went for hours and hours and hours. Some students got an entire lecture in response. So I've taken a couple of those questions, and I've made small videos out of those. And then eventually I'll publish the entire video. But I just want to remind you, as you listen to my responses, these are mostly on the fly. I mean, I didn't do a lot of preparation to answer these questions. I simply looked at it and said, here's how I would respond to that. Here's some thoughts of mine. And those thoughts also are in the context of this is a class that has a broad spectrum of students in it from a wide variety of different backgrounds and different opinions about mostly the topic of evolutionary biology. And so my responses have that in mind. Some of my responses are a little different than maybe the tact I would take if I were sitting down with you over a cup of coffee and talking about these subjects, or if I was talking to a specific critic or something like that. So just bear that in mind in terms of the style of response that I'm going to provide for some of these questions. I'm also in a sort of a teaching mode because I'm trying to use my responses to help them understand some principles. So I'm breaking down some of their questions into fundamental assumptions and trying to derive sort of like things that I know that they're going to need to know, through the rest of the class, and trying to sort of squeeze those elements into my answers to their questions. Okay, so with that caveat, or those caveats, let's proceed to answering a student question. Coming on up. In the first chapter, we learned that whales are mammals that have evolved to survive in the ocean through natural selection. But this was found as a result of modern research on whales and fossils. But if they evolved to survive in the oceans, why does this mean it was due to natural selection? And if a species were to go extinct, would one of the questions automatically be if they weren't able to adapt to the environment they were living in? I'm not sure I read that right. Automatically be if they weren't able to adapt to the environment they were in. Oh, I think the idea is, why would they go extinct rather than adapt? Hey, if they were so good at adapting by natural selection to this particular environment, survival in the sea, and then they go extinct, well, does that mean they weren't able to adapt? This actually goes back to what I was just saying a few moments ago. If the environment changes too rapidly, adaptation takes time. It's not an instantaneous thing. Yes, there might be a bacteria that in a new environment happens to have just the right mutation, and all of a sudden it's able to adapt to that new environment because it has that new characteristic. Antibiotic resistance, when suddenly an antibiotic is introduced to the environment, that particular bacteria that happened to have that resistance is better adapted, right? But for a large animal that's going to have offspring only every few years, so the generations it's going to take to generate new populations and spread a particular gene that's better adapted for that environment. If the environment changes rapidly, the organism is going to have to go through maybe hundreds of generations in order to catch up to that particular environment. They don't have hundreds of generations of time. And so they're going to be pushed to extinction. The environment changes and maybe it's not optimal for them, but they can still survive. They can limp along. And that's what a lot of species have done in history. The environment changes. The organisms are not the best fit for that new environment, but they're fit enough. And that's an important thing to remember. All you have to do is be fit enough to survive, and you can continue the species. But if they're not as fit as they were before, they might not have as many offspring. In which case the species starts to shrink. Maybe it's reduced in the amount of environments it can live in, right? But as long as it can sort of try to survive for hundreds of generations, it might experience enough changes that it can now start to expand maybe its niche again, or take on new niches, find a new way to survive in that new environment, and it will become a survivor. It'll be one of those species that actually manages to make it through this bottleneck of environmental change. The truth is, just like we just talked about, There's billions of species that have gone extinct. They never did adapt, right? They got squeezed out. And part of it also is because some other species adapted faster or was better in that particular new environment. And so they never could move into that environment because there was already another species that sort of took over, right? The competition got to them. All right, so back to this question. They evolved to survive in the ocean through natural selection, but is found as a result of modern research on whales and fossils. But if they evolved to survive in the ocean, what does it mean it was due to natural selection? I'm not sure what the question is here, although I think there might be a misconception about natural selection. Natural selection is simply referring to the process via the process in which organisms are living in an environment and their fitness is being, individuals are selected for whether they're better fit for that environment than another, and therefore have a better chance to survive and have offspring. And if they do, they can contribute their genetic information to the next generation. And that next generation will reflect their genetics more so than the other members of the population. And if those new genetics are more fit for that environment, then they're becoming more adapted to that environment. So if the environment is the ocean sitting there and organisms are gradually becoming better fit to live in the ocean is a constant environmental factor that's basically challenged them. Like, you can survive pretty well here, well enough, going back to the previous question, right? As long as you can survive well enough. Oh, actually, I was just saying that a moment ago. As long as you can survive in this environment, then there's a chance that in your descendants will continue to have more changes that will become even more fit for this particular environment. Right? Lots of organisms aren't perfectly fit for their environment. They're simply fit enough to survive there, and they're better fit than any other organism in that particular niche. Whales are an interesting example because after the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction, in which all the large sea reptiles went extinct, mosasaurs and plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs, right? Those organisms were large reptiles that fed and lived in the ocean in similar environments that whales do today. But all of a sudden they're gone. So now you just have this huge ocean with lots of food in it. And you have some sharks. But you really don't have these large animals that can graze and feed on fish and plankton and all these other things there. So animals on land that are semi-adapted to the water and can fish in the water and get things out of the water, they don't really have any competition out there, right, in the ocean. And so that is an amazing environment to maybe take advantage of. And so that's the challenge that world presented, to mammals living on land. Like, if you could adapt to this environment, you would have an abundance of food, right? And the way I'm saying that is actually kind of inappropriate. It's like, if you could adapt, as if organisms are like, hey, you know what? I think I'll change and go and live in the ocean. It's more like, hey, you've got thousands of animals living on land. They're competing with each other. The individuals that can spend more time in the water and get more food in the water than they can on land, they probably have a better chance of surviving because of the competition on land. They don't have as much competition in the water. And then when they have changes, they then are better adapted to being in the water. And then they have a few more changes because they're still living in the, as much as they can and getting food from the water. And therefore they continue to get better and better in being in the water. And since they don't have a lot of competition, it's like, I'm not perfect at this job, right? My snout is like over here. It's not all the way in the back of my head like a blowhole, which would be awesome. But I don't have a blowhole. But I can still put my head up and breathe some air once in a while, and I can live. I can survive. And I've got an abundance of food, and that's great. So I'll keep having offspring. And those offspring will just continue to better adapt to this world. And eventually you have something that's really well adapted to the world, those things. But if the environment changes really quickly, some whales go extinct, right? Especially if you have people hunting whales, right? They can't adapt to harpoons, powered harpoons. That's just something that is an environmental factor that's way beyond their control. And therefore, they could go extinct as a result of that new environmental factor.